Welcome to today's discussion on challenges facing the chemical manufacturing industry, how IFS ERP can help overcome some of those challenges. I'm Jay Gentle, and I'm the Channel Sales Director at Enterprise Consulting. Enterprise Consulting is a platinum channel partner for IFS, and this year we're celebrating 20 years of delivering services to manufacturers that use IFS in their businesses. Joining me is Bob Corrigan. Bob is the VP of Established Accounts for IFS. IFS is a global ERP software company with deep solutions that supports the needs of chemical manufacturers. The chemical manufacturing industry can be broken into 5 main subsectors. The emphasis here is not really just on the diversity of the industries, but the fact that processes and requirements can be very different. For example, a paint manufacturer is very different than a rubber and plastic or glass manufacturer. But while these subsectors all have some differences in the way they process the things that they make, the issues that we're going to be discussing today largely apply to all of these sectors under the chemical manufacturing industry. So Bob, tell us about some of the industry pain points that you're hearing from chemical manufacturers that are using IFS today.
Sure. Thanks, Jay. So some of the pain points that we see specifically in the chemical industry, the global competition is been around for quite a while in this particular sector. And there have been a lot of companies that have gone through consolidations, mergers, acquisitions, sell-offs. If you look at some of the giant companies all the way down to, the individually privately held companies. And, it's really as companies are looking to expand their portfolios. Again, you saw this particular sector has a very, very broad range. So, it's very hard to kind of talk in generalities, but if you're a paint manufacturer, you also want the actual raw materials that are going into your paints and the pigments. So maybe you're acquiring those companies that, only did pigments. So you have, that access. Or if you have companies that are doing, one type of a lubricant, they may want to expand in and do brake fluids, or they may want to move into, grease or gear lubes. And, so we see a fair amount of that happening, for consolidations and global competition, but also a little bit on supply chain management. Some of these are very bulky to move. Sometimes you're dealing with, raw materials that are measured by the rail car, in thousands of gallons, or, hundreds, maybe thousands of pounds in an individual batch. And then you're breaking it down and sometimes putting it into a small little fragrance bottle that may be, only a few grams. So they have done a lot on the area of supply chain consolidation to try to make it so they don't have to move the material around quite so much when they do their blending, their formulations, and their packaging. And so we've seen that really impact this particular industry. And again, if you look at like digital transformations, one of the areas that, some of the companies in the chemical aspects are affected by some demand that's being introduced, in the construction sector or in the homeowners and home builders, as well as commercial. We've got companies that are working and actually delivering smart coatings, self-healing paints, so that, if it gets a scratch, it will automatically repair itself, and then how it is affected by temperature, fade, different pressures, how much sunlight it's exposed to. So there's a lot of effort underway to really adopt some of these digital transformation strategies to improve their product, as well as, work out in the field directly with their customer or the consumer, and make sure that they're really keeping a pulse on what's happening out there, and, making sure that they can make, changes to their product as needed. Kind of goes into the next one on regulatory compliance. We have a lot of customers that are making materials that, some people don't want in landfills. They don't want them in the, wastewater systems. So, more and more effort on making sure that the chemicals that are being produced and added into cosmetics and into lubricants and into, food products, just making sure that all of those have kind of a life cycle to them. There's a lot of regulatory organizations out there that are regulating, how cosmetic testing gets done, what raw materials are in those cosmetics, and, whether or not they were, acquired through a process that a lot of end people buying those products are looking for, to make sure they're marked organic, make sure they're non-GMO. A lot of those types of things that are out there in certain industries that are in this chemical manufacturing sector. And then because of, of the skilled labor shortages that everyone's facing more and more across the world, not just in North America, trying to get much more efficient and being able to scale up your production with less people, which means a lot more automation, which then can help you with that labor shortage. You need, higher skilled labor because you can replace some of this now with robotics, larger batch mixing centers. So there's quite a few of the customers that are investing in a lot of capital to eliminate skilled labor as well as taking on that digital transformation.
Great. Thanks, Bob, for that insight. So this is a map showing the IFS solution and how chemical manufacturers can manage their businesses with the IFS solution. You want to highlight some of the key aspects of IFS that helps this industry?
Sure. So, I mean, chemical manufacturing, some of the unique things that you'll see in the IFS product, we have a very, very long history in chemical manufacturing in this particular sector. Therefore, we're not a discrete manufacturing company that's trying to adopt our product to do it. So if you look at something like, traceability of substances, formulations, all the material compliance that you have with transporting flammables and toxins, all of those types of things. IFS has that built right into our software to be able to handle that and, trace it. So, right from that product design all the way through the manufacturing and into the distribution. In the middle there, I think we talk about yields and byproducts. So this is another type of an industry where you'll start, you want to make maybe 3,000 gallons of something, but you're going to put it in gallon-sized containers, quart-sized containers, and pint-sized containers. And therefore, how big does that batch need to be? When you get into some of the reagent areas, a reagent may not work for this particular application, but it could work for another application. You have potency requirements in some industries. That's all built directly into IFS. And then on the right-hand side, traceability, shelf life and expiration. As you get into a lot of these products, they go into other products that extend shelf life, help shelf life, keep track of expirations. And, a lot of the raw materials that go into them do have very defined traceability requirements, because if you have a cosmetic, you want to know exactly what went into that in that particular batch or lot. So if there is something that goes wrong out in the consumer world, that you can trace it back and figure out what went wrong and decide how you're going to handle that. So some unique things that are in the IFS application that you don't find in a lot of our competitors' products.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Now tell about some of the, I guess, maybe highlights that you want to mention on this slide.
I think for, chemical manufacturing, again, some people just purely make a chemical and it's, used by others. Others will make things like polymers or rubbers or urethanes, and then they actually use those in their own products, as well as may supply them to other companies to utilize them. So having the ability to have a system that can go that whole path. I mean, if you're doing just chemicals and you're dealing just with formulations and you want to use a formulation in a production order, but maybe you want to still use a discrete bill of material, IFS allows you to basically have a full spectrum of how you want to actually use the system within your product. So that really gives a lot of flexibility. And then the other area is, new product development, as I mentioned, through the production, quality control and delivery, and full traceability all the way through, forward and back. Batch balancing is something that's unique, I think, in IFS that you won't find in a lot of other solutions out there. And that's where you're really matching, how you're going to put your batches together, how you're going to blend them, how you're going to formulate them, and then exactly how does that impact it depending on, how you're going to pack it, or how you're going to, if you're going to ship it bulk on a rail car out, or are you going to put it into, 5-gallon pails or, 1-ounce jars. So a lot of that is built directly into IFS batch balancing. And then a lot of the areas right now, as I said, there's more and more that are getting involved in, performing consulting and services to their customers. So you can, this particular sector has, chemists and people out working with their end customers, making sure that, they're making sure their products are meeting the demand. So they have kind of a service requirement that never really existed, for chemical manufacturers that's out there now, especially if you're in paints, inks, plastics, anything, rubber, compounding, polymers, all of those have in the field demand for a lot of services to make sure the product's performing.
Good. Thanks for that insight as well. I know you mentioned traceability a few times, and it's top of mind for a number of chemical manufacturers. Maybe you can just touch a little bit more on that concept.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, IFS has, a long history of building this into our product. We meet all the requirements in this particular industry. It'd be like the ISO 14,000. We meet, all the requirements that we see typically in pharmaceutical, in food and beverage. So all of those, really have that same vein of, can I trace everything that I use in putting something together and, know where it went, and then, have the ability to affect, any kind of a recall that might be required, or just fully handling, customer complaints, or, if you're supplying business to business, taking those reports back and figuring out exactly how to change your formulations or your cook times or whatever you were doing that might have affected that. So we have that throughout the entire application.
Good. Very good to know. Thanks, Bob. This is becoming a more and more popular topic as well. I mean, you talk about how sustainability management is impacting chemical manufacturers.
Yep. So IFS has had sustainability management built directly into our product for about 10 years now, and some of it was a result of some of the regulations that came in, such as REACH and RoHS, but more and more it's around that entire, what are the substances that are in this particular product, that whole product life cycle traceability, environmental declarations, particularly if you're dealing with anything that might be an allergen or, might be a corrosive, being able to track all of that. And IFS can really help any customer support all the regulatory requirements they have, and that's built in the software directly. And, it's out of the box. There's no third-party products or anything like that. It's completely integrated into the application throughout the application.
That's really good to know. I'm sure that'll be very helpful. Yeah, Bob, these are some of the customers that have been using IFS in their businesses in a chemical manufacturing. Maybe just tell a little bit about some of those. Oop, too far there.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, just a selection of some companies that, some people will maybe recognize, some and not others. You have companies like Epzina, Bell Labs, Forever Living, that are in various, well, they'll make raw materials that go into other products, yet they may make their own product. Bell Labs makes rodent control products that, they sell the actual chemicals as well as they manufacture them into, finished products. If you take Airboss, Hex, they both manufacture polymers, and then of course they sell those polymers to other, but they may actually use those themselves to make rubber products, vibration dampers. Firestone Polymers supplies Bridgestone for their tires. Forever Living, Harvest and produces aloe products, creams and lotions, and some under their own brand, and they sell them elsewhere. Hensel Coatings, very industrial coating paints. You take Omni, McLean, those are both lubricant manufacturers across the whole spectrum, oils, greases. You take Willamette Valley, there's a company that, does a lot of caulks, but they also actually make coatings for, well, they're the largest producer of coatings for potato seeds to help with the germination and prevent rot. Richardson is linseed oils of all kinds, food product for the most part. Envirotech, produces chemicals that are used for anti-icing. So
yeah, so really,
depending on where you live right now, that's probably in some of those salt alternatives that you see them spraying on the roads.
you're dating us now. Well, great. Yeah, this is definitely a great cross-section of customers, that you say, making different types of chemical-based products, that some of them go into their own products and some of them going into other products that are used elsewhere. Well, I appreciate your time today, Bob, and I appreciate everyone else's time and hearing a bit more about how IFS can support the needs of chemical-based manufacturers. Please contact me if you have any further questions or you want to learn more about how IFS and Enterprise Consulting can support your chemical manufacturing company.